Amen. So we're going to be in the book of Joshua. We're going to kind of be going through from chapter 6 over into chapter 8 a little bit. We're not going to just be reading the whole thing, but what I'm planning to do here is we're going to work through this passage of Scripture, and I'm going to try not to preach too much while we work through it, and then I'm going to give you the message that the Lord gave me to go with this story. But really what we're going to be talking about is the battle of Ai out of the book of Joshua. So in Joshua chapter 6, all throughout Joshua chapter 6, you're seeing the battle of Jericho, which really isn't a battle. It's really just taking that victory as they walked around the walls of Jericho, and the Lord just shoved those walls right down, and they were given immediate victory over that situation. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that passage of Scripture, but if you're not, you can totally jump back into Joshua chapter 6 on your own time and get yourself caught up on this story. But basically, just so you are aware, Israel has just seen immense victory over Jericho. This is a huge conquest. It was a very seemingly difficult place to overtake, and the Lord worked miraculously without them even having to fight for it. The Lord just handed them the victory over this area. And so now chapter 6, verse 18, this is an instruction from the Lord right after the walls come down and they've gone into Jericho. And the Lord says, "Do not take any of the things set apart for destruction, or you yourselves will be completely destroyed, and you will bring trouble on the camp of Israel. Everything made from silver, gold, bronze, or iron is sacred to the Lord and must be brought into his treasury." So they are given victory over Jericho, but they're given specific instruction about what to do when they go in. They're told that they are to destroy everything, and then those things that are sacred can be brought into his treasury. But other than that, everything else is to be destroyed. And they're giving very clear, very specific instructions. So right after that, everything is destroyed. And we know about the 2 spies, we know about Rahab, and all of that takes place. And then we'll go down into Joshua chapter 7. I just wanted to share that God gave that very clear instruction to set up this next story that we're going to go into. And so it says, chapter 7, verse 1, it says, "But Israel violated the instructions about the things set apart for the Lord. A man named Achan had stolen some of these dedicated things, so the Lord was very angry with the Israelites. Achan was the son of Carmi, a descendant of Zimri, son of Zerah of the tribe of Judah. Joshua sent some of his men from Jericho to spy out the town of Ai, east of Bethel, near Bethaven. When they returned, they told Joshua, 'There's no need for all of us to go up there. It won't take more than 2,000 or 3,000 men to attack Ai. Since there are so few of them, don't make all of our people struggle to go up there.'" So those first few verses set up this next situation. So they just came out of a great victory. We find out that it says Israel violated, and that's just because of one man's sin, this man Achan, who took some of those things that were supposed to be set apart for the Lord's treasury. He took them and he hid them and he kept them for himself. And then immediately they go into what should be the next battle, the battle of Ai. And it says that he sent out these spies to go scout it, and they look at it and they're like, "Hey, we have way too many men here. We don't really need all of these to make this battle successful. We go in and we scope it out based upon our last victories and how successful we've been. We don't even need to bother bringing everybody else up here to Ai because we've got it covered with just a few thousand. So we'll just take what we need and everyone else can kind of hang out here," right? So that's kind of their mindset going into this battle. So it says, "So approximately 3,000 warriors were sent, but they were soundly defeated. The men of Ai chased the Israelites from the town gate as far as the quarries, and they killed about 36 who were retreating down the slope. The Israelites were paralyzed with fear at this turn of events, and their courage melted away." So after the sin of Achan and Achan hiding away what was supposed to be set apart, they go into this battle confident that they have nothing to be worried about. They don't even bring their full military, and yet they were quickly defeated. 3,000 were sent. It says 36 were killed when they were retreating back. And it goes in next to Joshua's reaction to what just takes place. So Joshua and the elders of Israel tore their clothing in dismay, threw dust on their heads, and bowed face down to the ground before the ark of the Lord until evening. Isn't that kind of a funny way to mourn? Wouldn't it be crazy if we all just were like ripping our clothes and throwing dirt on our heads all the time? Like maybe people would just see it right off the bat. You wouldn't be able to hide if you were upset because you'd just be covered in dirt all the time. There's none of that like, I'm fine business. Like, you obviously had a moment, then maybe we should talk about it, right? There's no hiding the dismay here, okay? So then Joshua cried out, "Oh, sovereign Lord, why did you bring us across the Jordan River if you are going to let the Amorites kill us? If only we had been content to stay on the other side. Lord, what can I say now that Israel has fled from its enemies? For when the Canaanites and all the other people living in the land hear about it, they will surround us and wipe your name off the face of the earth. And then what will happen to the honor of your great name?" And so at this moment, we see Joshua's response. He's in anguish. He's upset. He's distraught. He was like, how did this happen? Like, we specifically sent spies, so we knew we would be equipped to know what we needed. What happened here? And then he says a couple of things, a couple of questions that he has for God. The first one he says is, how could you abandon us? Why would you bring us this far? And in Joshua's mind, he doesn't know of the sin in the camp. He has no idea that there's been anything that has violated that connection with God. So he begins to blame God for the defeat. And he begins to look at God and saying, how could you leave us here? Like, we should have just stayed on the other side. We shouldn't have even come over here. Like, why would you leave us hanging? But this is something really beautiful that he says next. And I just can imagine myself in that situation. I would probably be thinking very selfishly, thinking about the imminent danger that I was in. If other surrounding armies found out that I was weak enough to lose this battle, now they might come overtake me. But what he says is, he says, what would happen to your great name? What would happen to the honor of your great name? And so that is, I feel like that's just an extra nugget in there. It doesn't really go with my sermon, but how could you skip over that? Man, how sweet it is to see somebody who's focused not just on his own misery, but on the idea that the Lord's name would be forgotten or dismissed. Like, that is awesome to think that in the middle of a huge battle, of a huge defeat, that the focus is not just on himself and his own misery, but the fact that he desires that God's name would be glorified. How many times when we're in the middle of a defeating season do we worry and contemplate on whether or not God's name would be getting honor? Oftentimes we turn our nose up and we turn the other direction. And even though he has some legitimate questions, like he's like, God, why would you why would you let us be defeated? Why are you abandoning us? What's happening here? He has some legitimate questions for God because in his mind, he feels like he's been doing what was asked of him without knowing of the sin in his camp. But even with the questioning, he says, what will happen to the honor of your name if we're wiped off the face of the earth? Who would represent your name? Who would represent your miracles? Who would represent all that you've done so far? There would be no one left if they were to wipe us off. And man, like I said, that's just bonus. Like, it's just cool to read that that's something that was of a concern to him, even in the midst of defeat, that he cared. Man, that's convicting for me. I don't know about y'all, but there's a lot of times that I get so wrapped up in my own self. And I do want to point the finger to God. And yet I can say, man, God, if you don't turn this around, I'm okay as long as you get the glory. God, if you don't turn this around, I'm okay, but what's going to happen if we're obliterated? So who's going to give you the praise? Who's going to give you the glory? Who's going to give you that set apart? Where's that set apart group of people who are going to give you all that you're worthy of? And I just think that's a really cool perspective that he has in the midst of this moment of defeat. But so then it moves on here, and we see in verse number 10, it says, but the Lord said to Joshua, and I love the Lord's quick response. And he says to Joshua, get up. Why are you lying on your face like this? Israel has sinned and broken my covenant. They have stolen some of the things that I commanded must be set apart for me. And they have not only stolen them, but have lied about it and hidden the things among their own belongings. That is why the Israelites are running for their enemies in defeat. For now Israel itself has been set apart for destruction. I will not remain with you any longer unless you destroy the things among you that were set apart for destruction. So here the Lord quickly, seeing Joshua in his despair, he quickly reveals to him, listen, dude, here's what's up. Here's what happened. I know that you feel like this came out of nowhere, but actually there was sin in the camp, and I need to show this to you so you can make it right. And unfortunately, that sin came with a high cost, that he's like, listen, if you don't deal with this, then I'm removing my presence. And this is quickly after Joshua just realized what happens when the Lord removes his presence, because he was able to go into Jericho, which seemed like a much mightier fortress to take down, a much mightier city that he had to go in and conquer. And they did that with such ease because the hand of God was on it. And now he's experienced what seemed to be an easy city to conquer, but he was defeated because God's hand wasn't on it. And so he's looking at this and he's recognizing, Lord, what I need is your hand, because that's what makes the difference. It doesn't matter if I feel like I'm equipped enough. If your hand isn't on it, if you're not in it, then I can't do it. But if you're in it, I can do bigger than I can do by myself. And so the Lord makes a threat here and saying, like, listen, you got to go in. Here's the sin. Let me expose it to you. And now it's time for you to go in and clean it up. But you know what I love about this is that sometimes we're just like this situation where sometimes we are the ones that have sin in our camp, and we're looking to the Lord and we're saying, God, why is it like this? And blah, 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 blah. And sometimes he reveals, like, listen, this is something you need to go clean up. There's something here that you need to go get a hold of. But you know what the awesome thing about that is that sometimes it's as simple as that solution. It's as simple in seeking out your heart and figuring out what that thing is that you need to get rid of, to cleanse out, and then you're back in business. Sometimes it's as simple, and that's an easy solution to say, you know what, God, show to me what it is that's off right now. And if there's something that I can get into shape, let me do it. And I'll surrender it to you. I'll let you clean me up. I'll let you do the work. But God, you reveal that thing to me. And I think that's such a humble heart to come to the Lord in that way. Okay, I said I wasn't going to preach while we went through this. So I got to reel it back in so we can stay focused, okay? So here we realize that it's this one man's sin that led to God's hand not being on them when they go into Ai. And so he gives them direction, and it would take us a long time to read through all of this. So I'm just going to quickly kind of speed you up from here until the beginning of chapter 8. So basically what happens is they go in the camp. They go through a couple rounds of kind of sorting through people to figure out who the person is that has sinned against the Lord. And they end up finding it was Achan. They end up finding he does admit, he was like, yeah, I did that. And he tells them exactly where the stuff is. They go in, they take it out, they dispose of it properly, they do what was supposed to be done all along. And then unfortunately, Achan, his whole family, all of his livestock, all of his belongings were destroyed. They were stoned and then burned, and it ended up becoming a much bigger ordeal than if he had just obeyed in the first place. But basically, they come in and they clear house. They take inventory of who this could be. They get the sin out of the camp. They deal with the issue, and then they move on. Okay, so now, after this is all done, after they've done what the Lord told them to do, to go in and clear house a little bit, the Lord speaks again to Joshua. And this time he says, do not be afraid or discouraged. Take all your fighting men and attack Ai, for I have given you the king of Ai, his people, his town, and his land. You will destroy them as you destroyed Jericho and its king. But this time you may keep the plunder and the livestock for yourselves. Set an ambush behind the town. Okay, so now they are promised victory going back into Ai, and they're sent to go back and do exactly what they did before. And this time they're also given permission to take the plunder of whatever they get out of the city of Ai. So they go back. It says, so Joshua and all the fighting men set out to attack Ai. Joshua chose 30,000 of his best warriors and sent them out at night with these orders: hide in the ambush close behind the town and be ready for action. When our main army attacks, the men of Ai will come out to fight as they did before, and we will run away from them. We will let them chase us until we have drawn them away from the town. For they will say, the Israelites are running away from us as they did before. Then while we are running from them, you will jump up from your ambush and take possession of the town. For the Lord your God will give it to you. Set the town on fire as the Lord has commanded. You have your orders. So they left and went to the place of ambush between Bethel and the west side of Ai, but Joshua remained among the people in the camp that night. Early the next morning, Joshua roused his men and started towards Ai, accompanied by the elders of Israel. All of the fighting men who were with Joshua marched in front of the town and camped on the north side of Ai, with the valley between them and the town. That night, Joshua sent about 5,000 men to lie in ambush between Bethel and Ai on the west side of the town. So they stationed the main army north of the town and the ambush west of the town. Joshua himself spent that night in the valley. When the king of Ai saw the Israelites across the valley, he and his army hurried out early in the morning and attacked the Israelites at a place overlooking the Jordan Valley. But he didn't realize there was an ambush behind the town. Joshua and the Israelite army fled toward the wilderness as though they were badly beaten. Then all the men in the town were called out to chase after them. In this way they were lured away from the town. There was not a man left in Ai or Bethel who did not chase after the Israelites, and the town was left wide open. So the rest of the story, again, that's a whole lot of reading. I don't want to continue to read the whole thing. So basically they go in with a game plan. And their plan is to do a redo of exactly what happened before. So their game plan is to restage their defeat from the last time. So they have a few thousand men who are going to go in just as they did before, and they're going to retreat as if they had been lost. Because the last time we saw that they were chased out towards the wilderness. So it goes into telling us that this time what happens is whenever they chase them out into the wilderness, they have thousands of men waiting around Ai ready to pounce, basically, once they leave the city wide open. So all of these men, all of these soldiers go chasing after the Israelites, and they end up chasing them into the wilderness. Then they're surrounded by Israelites. The Israelites overtake them, and then they burn down their city. And so they basically play a little trick on them by making them feel like they're pretty confident that this is what happened last time. I can come back and do the same thing. We'll run them out just like we did before. They probably were like, man, these guys are stupid. Like, they just did this, and we just defeated them. Like, what are we doing here? So they come back. And they end up being victorious. And one of the cool things about that is it says that they left it wide open. They had seen this before. They knew the Israelites were going to be a simple defeat. And so they left their town wide open for the Israelites to come in and overtake it. They weren't able to then protect it from attack. They didn't leave anybody there to protect their women and children and livestock and city, because they all just thought, oh, well, we'll just chase them out of here again. But it ended up being a simple defeat. They ended up being victorious, okay? So now we've worked through that whole teaching. Now we can take a little break from the reading and the teaching. And I'm going to give you a few of the takeaways that I had to write down when I was supposed to just be teaching this, okay? Some of the things that I felt like were jumping off the page to me about this story that I think are so applicable for us, some takeaways that we can get. And the first one is to not go to battle on your own. And the thing that stuck out to me about this is when you look at the first time that the Israelites go to battle to Ai, the Lord does not instruct them to do that. You see, the second time, the Lord instructs them to go back to Ai, and he gives them specific instructions on what to do when they get there. But it doesn't say there in the beginning of chapter 7 that the Lord told Joshua to send them to go. It just says Joshua kind of moved on. He was like, okay, we defeated Jericho, time to move on to Ai. And so the one thing the Lord showed me was, if you notice in that chapter that there's no need for that battle, that the Lord has not opened the door for that, they are going into a battle without even being sent by the Lord. And there's a lot of times that I see myself going into battles that the Lord did not send me in to fight. And there's a lot of times that I can open myself up to defeat because I allow myself to enter into battles I was not asked to fight. And how often do we go fighting these battles that the Lord does not call us to? There is no fight worth fighting without the Lord. And it was very simple for them to see that when they saw how easily they were defeated with the few men they thought they needed to overtake it. It seemed like a simple victory. There's a lot of times we get ourselves caught up in things. We follow little rabbit trails. We go on to the next thing without the Lord really moving us to the next thing. Sometimes we get overwhelmed and we start to question God. We begin to say, God, how come I didn't get the victory? How come this didn't work out the way that I thought? How come this opportunity didn't pan out? And sometimes I think the Lord said, instead of waiting on me to give you direction for the next step, you took it into your own hands and you chose to walk yourself into a battle that I didn't call you to fight. And then we question God and we wonder why he's not delivering us, why we're ending up feeling defeated, why we're ending up feeling overwhelmed and overcome by the enemy. And it's because we walk into a battle without the blessing and the presence of God, because we're walking into it by ourselves. And so when the Lord was showing me that, I was realizing that how much sweeter the victory was for Joshua and the Israelites when the Lord commanded them to go into Ai, gave them specific instruction, and then they were given and they were promised the victory by the Lord. And so I want to encourage you this morning that if you are trying to walk into a battle or you're trying to walk into a situation that the Lord has not guided you into, then you can expect defeat in your own effort. But I can tell you that if you would listen to the voice of God and wait on him to speak to you before you move, then you will be secured the victory. That doesn't mean it's not going to be easy or that it's going to be easier, that it's not going to take some effort. Because Joshua and the Israelites, they had to go in and they had to fight the battle. They had to do the work. But what was different between the first time and the second time was that the Lord had opened the door. The Lord had spoken to them to go. He had given them a game plan and he had given them the means to walk out what it was that he was calling them to do. But sometimes we get so excited over the last thing that God did, or maybe what the Lord spoke to us to do was successful. Just like Jericho. They were so successful in Jericho that they were itching to go on to the next thing. And sometimes, even though it's with good intention, we get excited and we get itching to do the next thing. And we want to do God, what do you have next? Show me what to do next. Show me where to go next. I want to make the next move. And we're always looking for something bigger and something better, something else that will fulfill us and excite us and get us pumped up. But really, if you jump ahead of God, then you're jumping ahead of the hand of God. And I don't know about you, but I would much rather be patiently waiting for the Lord to direct my path than to jump ahead of his hand and end up in defeat. And so my question for you this morning is, how many of you are fighting losing battles because they're battles that you've walked into on your own, knowing full well that the God of heaven did not call you to go that way? And as believers, we can even say that what we're doing is for the Lord, but if his hand is not on it, I don't want it. I don't want to be apart from his presence. Because they made it very clear in their attempt to go on without the Lord's blessing that without him it was impossible to defeat even the smallest of enemies. And so I really want to encourage you guys to be reminded that we cannot become prideful and think that we've got it on our own. Because even though I know that they knew that God was the reason that they got the victory at Jericho, I sometimes wonder if they were just moving from a little bit of, excitement and pride that, we just overtook Jericho. We can go on to conquer the next thing. But sometimes the Lord still needs to take those opportunities to humble us in that moment, to say, be reminded that you did not defeat Jericho. I defeated Jericho. And I let you be a part of me defeating Jericho. Because there's a lot of times that we can get real self-righteous and prideful and excited about the things that we're doing for the Lord. But really what's happening is that we're forgetting that it was a miraculous thing that God let us be a part of. And one thing I want to know too is that in chapter 7, verse 5, it even says, as they are coming back away, as they're retreating back from this defeat, it says that the Israelites were paralyzed with fear at this turn of events, and their courage melted away. So these are some guys who had just seen one of the biggest, like we still talk about Jericho's walls coming down. We still talk about how grand and miraculous that was. So these are the same guys who were there marching around those walls that just saw God do something impossible. And now at the very sight of defeat, they completely lose any amount of courage they had. It says their courage melted away. They were paralyzed with fear because 36 people died in an attempt that they thought was going to be so easy. And so I think a lot of times when we walk into these battles that the Lord does not ask us to fight, we walk ourselves right into some crippling fear. And there's a lot of fear surrounded whether or not I'm going to make it through this. And that's because if God's not in it, there probably should be some fear there, honestly. But if you're feeling anxious and overwhelmed, you're feeling fearful, I think it's time for you to ask the Lord, is this something that you're leading me to do? Or is this something that I've walked into on my own? Because if I've walked into it on my own, then I need to repent, I need to walk away from it, and I need to ask the Lord to put me in the right path. But I need to be confident that if this is something that the Lord has walked me into, He is promising me the victory. And then that fear and that anxiety is a lie straight from hell. Because if I'm walking on my own, yeah, there probably should be some fear. But if I'm walking after the things that God has called me to do, there is no fear. There is no enemy in hell that can keep me from that victory. And so for me to stand in the face of God who has promised me the victory and to be in fear is to believe a lie more than I believe the truth. And so when you're facing a battle and you're feeling overwhelmed by fear, allow the Lord to show you whether or not that's a battle you're supposed to be in. Doing it on your own will always cause you to be humbled in the end, which is great, I guess. At least there's a benefit to it, right? We end up walking away feeling a little bit more humble. But these same people who had seen God's miraculous lost their courage because of defeat. And so there's a lot of times that when we feel like we're defeated, or maybe we even feel like God didn't come through, we have to ask ourselves, did God even ask me to go do that thing? Did God call me into it? Was that my own poor choices that I'm now blaming God for? Because truthfully, if God led me to it, I'm only going to be victorious. And even if I'm waiting for the victory to come, there will be a peace about it. There will be a knowing about it, knowing that, God, this is what you call me to do. Doesn't make it easy. Doesn't mean that it doesn't come without a little bit of struggle. But I know that you have made me victorious, and I can just rest knowing that I am more than a conqueror in Christ. And that if you've called me to it, you're going to bring me through it, right? So the next little takeaway that I got out of this story was for you to not sell out to second best. The consequence of Achan's sin could have been easily avoided if he had just waited on God. Because what do we know? After reading the whole story, after Achan is destroyed, we find out that when they get to go in to the next battle, they get to keep all of the plunder. So if he had been obedient, if he had chosen to listen to the command of God, his life would have been spared. And he would have gotten to take the same plunder in the next battle. It was all about obedience. It wasn't about the stuff that God didn't want him to have, because God was willing for him to take it in the next place. And sometimes we wonder, like, God, why are you withholding this from me? Or it would be a lot easier if I just went about this my own way. Or, or even I think about this when it comes to tithing. And I think I would much rather keep this money for myself. But how much more am I missing the blessing because I'm refusing to take part of something bigger than myself? And so even though in Achan's mind, I'm sure he's looking at these things around him thinking, well, we're just going to destroy this stuff. Like, we're just going to this stuff is worthwhile. Like, what's the big deal if I take a little bit back to my camp and I just keep a little bit with me? But let me tell you, it was not about the stuff. It was 100% about the obedience, because there was a command from God to not touch it, to destroy it, and to walk away from it. But here in the moment, that the fleeting desire of his eyesight, he's looking before him at something that looks like it would be gratifying, something that looks like would give him temporary pleasure, something that looks like, oh, I can obtain this right now. To him, he sold out for something that was second best, ended up costing him his entire life. And honestly, it went beyond that, because there was a lot of consequence to his sin in this story. One person's sin. But if he had just held on and trusted that the Lord does not give a command without the promise of blessing, he could have been one of the faithful ones to receive the plunder in the next battle. But in that moment, what he saw before him looked promising. It looked good. It looked exciting. Achan lost sight of the importance of obedience because of what looked appealing. What looked appealing to him was more exciting than being obedient to the command of God. And God didn't give that command without warning. He let him know what was going to happen. But in his own prideful mind, he was like, I'm good. I'd rather take this now. I don't know if he thought he could hide it from God, like that God wouldn't see it. I don't know what he was thinking, honestly, but Achan saw only immediate gratification, not the upcoming abundance of God's favor. And so what he went after was the thing that he could quickly obtain, that he could get, he could keep for himself, he could hide it away, that nobody would know about it, right? Something that nobody would see, nobody would care about, nobody would know. But unfortunately, he could have had unlimited plunder. But what he sold out for was a small portion of what could have been. Man, how many times do we do that? We could have the whole plunder if we wait on the Lord's timing. But yeah, what we want is immediate gratification. What we want is something that's going to be a quick fix that I can get my hands on right now. Something that I don't have to work for later on. But what the Lord is saying, that if you just hold on and you just stay in obedience, what I have coming for you is more than you could even imagine. It's greater than the shiny thing right in front of your face. It's greater than anything you could wrap your mind around. Because rather than this little token set aside, the instant destruction, he could have had unlimited plunder. Unlimited plunder. And here's the thing, is a little bit of sin in the camp does a whole lot of damage. We're looking at this, and we're not looking at thousands of people who were disobedient. We're looking at thousands of people who were obedient and one man in the camp who was disobedient. And I hear Christians all the time that say, oh, it's just a little, it's just a little sin. It's not that big of a deal. It's just, I was just a little disobedient. It's not that big of a deal. But let me tell you from my own personal experience of being a human with a free will who makes stupid decisions sometimes a little bit of sin can bring a whole lot of destruction. Sometimes a little bit of sin can open a door that I have trouble closing for the rest of my life. Sometimes a little bit of sin can destroy the lives of people all around me. Sometimes a little bit of sin can open the door for a generational curse that my children and my children's children and my children's children's children will be fighting against, because I thought a little bit of sin didn't make any difference. But the little bit of sin in this camp caused a whole lot of damage. The result of Achan's sin, here's some of the things that I pulled from this story. Many men died. Israel's army melted away in fear. Joshua questioned God. God threatened to withdraw his presence. Achan and his family had to be destroyed. All the consequence of a little bit of sin in the camp. But here's the awesome thing about our God who restores and who is faithful, because the results of the elimination of that sin, the result of the camp getting cleaned up and everything being put back in order, the results of that were God's encouragement, God's presence in battle, God's guidance and promise of victory, God's permission to keep plunder for themselves. even God can take the sin in the camp that's polluted and destroyed and turn that around for a victory, which is awesome. Because even though sin is a big deal, God is a much bigger deal. And he can take the little bit of sin in your camp and he can remove it and purify it and make you clean and holy and presentable before the Lord. And man, I just got fired up last week thinking about people being set free from addiction. Because how many of y'all know that addiction is one of those things? It's a little bit of a sin that starts with just a little bit of something that opens a door, and then it becomes a monster that takes over. And not only just for that person, but for their family, for their children, for their job, for their well-being, for their finances. It overrules their entire life. But how glorious is God that he can restore even the things that seem too far gone, that seem too big, that seem too much, that started as just a little bit of sin in the camp, but became a monster. And the Lord is faithful to restore those things back to the condition that he created them to be. And so the Lord here is saying, listen, you can go back and you can defeat this army. And I'm going to take the little bit of sin that you had. We're going to remove it. We're going to purify it. You're going to walk into this thing in full obedience. You're going to walk in fully with my presence. And you're going to walk in with the victory. And you know what? You're going to battle not from the position of your setback. You're going to battle from the position of the victory that I've already promised for you. So now we're walking in, we're not melting away with lack of courage because of what just happened. What we're walking in is with a boldness of knowing that the victory is already mine, that the victory has already been accomplished because I'm walking in the obedience of the Lord. I'm walking after the things that he's called for me to do. Hebrews 11:25 says that sin is only pleasurable for a season. Only pleasurable for a season. So when Achan is going in to Jericho and he's working with them to, destroy and clear out and do whatever needs to do, and he chooses to tuck away that little bit of treasure for himself, there might have been an excitement there. There might have been some immediate gratification. Might have fulfilled a need that he had. It might have made him feel more secure, made him feel like he had everything, he could provide for his house because he had what he needed. He might have felt really good about that decision. But he didn't even get to use the silver that he took. He didn't even get to use the plunder. He got as far as digging a hole in the ground and hiding away that thing that brought him some momentary pleasure. And how many of you guys know, I don't know a person in this room who hasn't sinned. I've sinned, I've been there, and in the moment, it feels good. In the moment, sin feels like the answer. In the moment, sin feels like the remedy to whatever it is that you're lacking, or it feels like the remedy to the pressure around you, or it meets a need in your life that you're not meeting with Jesus. And so in the moment, that sin can feel like the solution to all of your problems is just giving in to this thing, For me, I remember just wanting to fill the voids that I knew in my life with anything that could maybe make me feel better. It felt like the answer. And so for Achan, I imagine that taking this little bit of plunder for him was feeling like it was the solution, the remedy to whatever need, or maybe it was just greed or selfishness. I don't know his reasoning behind it. But that sin was enjoyable for a moment. And now we see in the big picture how destructive it was. And how destructive sin can become. Even just the smallest bit. Even just one person out of thousands removed the hand of God of Israel. Man, that's insane to think about. And so all the time we tell ourselves, it's not that big of a deal. Just a little bit. I've got control. I can stop whenever I want to. I can repent whenever I want to. All it's going to take is one prayer and it's all going to go away. And I'm just going to ask for forgiveness today. And then I'm going to go back and do what I was doing yesterday. And then next Sunday I'll come back and I'll ask for forgiveness again because God is a gracious and forgiving God. So it really doesn't matter what I do, right? And this is not for me to bring condemnation or to make you feel guilty. This is me having concern for your soul and knowing that from the biblical example that I see, a little bit of sin is a lot bigger of a deal than you make it out to be. And as a shepherd in this house, I'm concerned for where you are leading yourself when you tell yourself the lie that it doesn't matter what I do and a little bit of sin in the camp isn't going to hurt anything. Because all it does is open the door to destruction in your life. And I hate that. I hate it. And it's also not fair because you are not the only one who is affected by your sin. You're not the only one. If you're a parent, your children are affected by your sin. If you're married, your spouse. If you are doing something not appropriate in the workplace, your coworkers are affected by your sin. Your family members who love and care about you are affected by your sin. You know, there are a lot of times that your sin reaps the pain of somebody else. And so even beyond yourself, that little bit of sin, you might think, well, it's only about me. It's not a big deal. It's my own thing. I can deal with it. But there are a lot of times that your sin goes beyond just you. Goes beyond just you. Throughout Israel's history, blessings came when people turned away from their sin. And the same goes for you. Blessings come when you turn away from the sin and you walk towards Jesus. Now, here's the awesome thing, is that Israel had to go into their camp. They had to seek it out. They had to do the work to get rid of it, to destroy it. But all that God asked you to do is to come before him and say, Lord, search my camp. Look for those things that are not pleasing to you. And then you just get to surrender them. And he does the cleanup work. He takes care of it, and then he blesses it. That's the awesome thing, is that God does not even expect you to do that work because Jesus did all the work on the cross. You get to just surrender it and walk free from it. Okay, last, final takeaway. This is my favorite one, okay? This is the one I really needed that pen for. Because when I realized this, I mean, maybe everybody else has heard this story and you thought the same thing. But I was like about to walk out of that class so I could go have a moment with the Lord when he was showing me this. But this last and final takeaway is that God uses your greatest defeat as the launching pad for your greatest victory. And the thing that I love about this story is that their plan of attack mimicked the defeat that they had just experienced. Their weapon for their victory was the defeat they already experienced. How cool is that? So they go in and they make an example of the enemy by showing them that what was once a failure is now God set up for a comeback. How cool is that? How cool is it that what you think is your greatest setback is actually God's materials for your greatest comeback? That when they go in and they begin to mimic what happened in the past, they begin to go in and pretend like they're doing the same old thing, and they retreat away from the enemy. Now the enemy believes that they're already defeated. So he comes in and he begins to chase them into the wilderness, just like they had done before. It's like cat and mouse, like they're just doing the same thing. They're just going to chase after him again. But here's the thing, what the enemy, which is, AI, what the enemy didn't realize in that moment is that they were being tricked. And that what looked like a similar defeat was now propelling them into their greatest victory. And so I think about those things in our lives. I think about the things that we look at as in our lives as the junk that disqualifies us from being victorious, the junk that we've always run back to, those things that we feel like keep us from walking forward in the Lord are the very things that God's going to use to launch you into your greatest victory. How awesome is that? That God looked at them and he said, you know what? This comeback is not going to only benefit you, but it's going to be for my glory. Because remember, Joshua's heart was, Lord, what's going to happen to your name? It's going to be for his glory, and it's going to completely squander the works of the enemy. Because here's what happened. When they went in and they played as if they were going to be defeated again, it left the enemy's camp wide on open. And they were able to go in, not only defeat the people, but completely overtake the works of their enemy. And so here's how awesome it is. We sing the song, I went to the enemy's camp and I took back what he stole from me. But you know what? They said, I'm going to the enemy's camp and I'm burning it down because the work of the enemy is not even going to go forward. There's going to be nothing to be said of the town of Ai, but they will be talking about the Israelites forever. And let me tell you that whenever God takes that thing that felt like defeat, he takes that thing that feels like a setback, setback. He takes that thing that feels like failure and he uses it. It's going to be what launches you in to the greatest call of God on your life. It's going to launch you into the greatest victory that you've ever seen. It's going to walk you into the greatest amount of freedom that you've ever experienced. It's going to walk you in to setting the chains loose on some other people. It's going to set you right up in for success in the future in everything that you do, because the enemy would like for you to stay and feel defeated. He would like for you to feel like the Israelites did when they were consumed by fear and when their courage completely melted away, because all they could think about was their defeat. All they could think about was the failure. All they could think about was the men that were lost. All they could think about was the impending doom that was coming because they were going to be surrounded by their enemies. You know, the songs we sing this morning were totally on purpose. Like, God is just so cool. But I think about that song that says, and it may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. Because in that moment, it felt as if they were going to be surrounded and completely obliterated. But what they didn't realize is that whenever they decided to link up with God's hand and with God's blessing and with God's favor, that they were going to walk right on out of there and they were going to be victorious as the children of God. And I love the line in the other song that says, I think it's by your spirit I will rise from the ashes of defeat. From the ashes of defeat. You're not just coming up from, a perfectly polished package of a story. You're coming up from your past that might look like garbage. You're coming up from a past that might make you feel trapped. You might come from a past that makes you feel like you're disqualified. But let me tell you, the very junk you think disqualifies you is actually fuel to the fire that God has placed inside of you to burn. And what he's looking for is for people who are willing to go before him and say, God, I'm ready for you to search out my camp. I'm ready for you to remove whatever doesn't purify you. But God, I'm ready for you to take that defeat and that failure and that setback. And I'm ready for you to use it for your glory, to make your name famous. Amen. And so I love looking at that, and I love thinking about them leaving, the enemy just leaving his camp wide open because he's stupid like that. And I just think about how, we can go in and even, it's not even just about our own battle. It's about overtaking for those around us. Just like your sin affects more than just you, your victory does too. Because when you get victory in an area, then you can share that. You can impart that to somebody else. You can share with them that it's possible for their defeat to become victory, for their setback to become a comeback. When they can be surrounded by hearing of the promises and the faithfulness of God, then it goes beyond yourself. It becomes something bigger than you. And it goes back to that concept of what's going to happen to your name, Lord. Because when I'm victorious, his name is glorified. Because it's not about me. I don't do the work. I don't win the battle. But I want to tell you that the battle isn't over. Just like they thought when they walked away from Ai the first time, they thought the battle was over. They thought they were defeated. But I feel like there's some people in the room who are feeling like the battle around them is bigger than they can handle. The battle around them is more than they can stand. The battle around them looks like imminent defeat. But I can tell you that the battle isn't over. And even if it looks like defeat right now, God is using it for victory. Even if it looks like a setback right now, God is using it for that comeback. The battle isn't over. It's not over till God says that it's over. And if God is leading you to it, you can be sure that you're going to be victorious. So I think there's some of us in the room who need to stand from a place of victory and fight from a place of victory. Not fighting from our own effort, from our own self, but standing from a place of knowing what the Lord has promised and knowing what the enemy is actually capable of, which is not much compared to the name of Jesus. And standing in that place of victory and fighting and saying, you know what, enemy, you might make me feel defeated, but I know the truth. I know that I am victorious. And I know who reigns. I know who's in control, regardless of what the enemy says. Your past failure is your weaponry going forward into your next battle. The Lord is using what you thought was defeat to equip you for the next thing. Because you learned from that one, you gained from that one, you grew from that one, and now you're ready to take on the enemy full force. And this time you're ready to go, right?